Thank you all for coming and welcome to our live stream audience. Hopefully you can all hear me very well. Do intros first. So, as was said, I'm the Director of Software Development at Ally. The kind of real-world explanation of what that is I run Ally's JavaScript practice, and so I work a lot in React and in Node, and integrating things into WordPress and working in Gutenberg, which we're going to talk about a little bit today as well. I've got my PhD in Science and Technology Studies from RPI, and I wrote a dissertation about web accessibility, entitled Disability in Cyberspace, the Politics of Inclusion and Exclusion in Web Development Groups.
And I'm Pattie Reaves. My job title is I'm a senior user experience developer at Ally. I work very closely with Kevin. And my domain of development is really front-end development, so that place between where designs come in and where they're realized in making a website. I like to think of myself as an accessibility evangelist, enthusiast. I'm certainly not an expert. I feel like it's an ongoing process of learning. And I don't know if there's like peak expertise achieved, but in the sense that I've worked on these practices, especially very deliberately in the past year, projects for museums, higher education, nonprofits, and government. Kevin and I are taking the lessons that we've learned and trying to achieve the highest levels of accessibility for these projects, and to share you how we've been able to do so. I think that our talk has really, Robin had an amazing talk at the beginning of this conference talking about why accessibility is important, and I think in particular in higher education we understand, kind of like the stakes of making sure that our websites are accessible to the largest number of people. So our talk doesn't necessarily, we go over where that conversation, but it's more like practical tools and how to get from we need to make our site accessible to get into that point.
So what you'll get out of this talk, apparently that emoji does not translate onto Windows. It's supposed to be a woman looking like this. So what you get out of this talk is how to work proactively. So in the best case, all of us would be making accessible sites as we go along and wouldn't have to go back and retrofit. But we know that that isn't necessarily always possible. You may have inherited a site that's not accessible. There may have been an artificial deadline that came into play that caused you to put something up that was not accessible, and we have to go back and retrofit. So we'll talk about approaches for that as well. How to check your work as you go along, and to make sure that you're not introducing regressions in accessibility as you introduce new features, or as you squash one accessibility bug, you don't introduce another one. And then also how WordPress is changing, especially the introduction of the Gutenberg block editor, which is coming, whether we are ready for it or not, or whether we like it or not, and we'll talk about strategies for dealing with that as well.
So the best place to start when building an accessible site is with no site. It's really a nice place to be if you can start a project from scratch, because a project from scratch will be accessible from the start. What we do when we set up a new project is that we, at the very start of the project, we establish linters. And we're going to go, Kevin and I are going to go into detail about what these linters are and how they work later in the talk. But can show of hands, anyone here not know what a linter is? So a linter is a set of rules that you apply to your code that every time you attach them to some sort of build process, like in Webpack, or sometimes you can attach it to your IDE, and it's kind of like a spell checker. It says like that, this doesn't conform to our style standards, and this code needs to be rewritten in a different way. It's a really wonderful tool to use, because instead of having a person try to inform you the equivalent of, hey, you misspelled this word or your grammar is wrong, a computer is doing it for you. So you can really have a uniform style of your code across your whole code base. And it can help educate your developers about the best accessibility practices. The next thing that we do is we make sure that we develop regression testing. So as you're releasing new code and moving towards publishing your final project, you make sure that new features that you build are QA'd and that they're not making your site less accessible. And then making sure that you test with real users who are going to be using your site in various modes.
So how to approach a site that you already have and to retrofit and make it more accessible is relatively similar to the new site build process, except at the beginning of that process, you have to perform an audit. There are some tools you can use to help you perform that audit, and there's a necessary component of that is going to be a human being who understands the standards actually going through the site and checking things as well. Good tools will typically lead you in the right direction of being able to look at specific things within the site. So a tool may say, here's an image, it has alt text. You need to read the alt text and understand if this is an appropriate use of alt text for this particular image. So it can flag places where alt text doesn't exist, but automated tools can't tell you whether the text that you've provided is actually a good alternative representation of that image. So the first phase is performing that audit, figuring out where you stand and what needs to be fixed. The next part is to plan and prioritize your fixes. So it may be the case that you look at the audit results and you find there are a couple of really high priority bugs that are preventing people with certain types of disabilities from using your site at all. So maybe your navigation is completely inaccessible to people using a screen reader. That is a huge problem. That's something we have to fix right away. Or you may discover that you have a particular type of problem that is not necessarily so severe on its own, but it's present on every single page of your site. So you may decide to tackle that first because it's so prevalent. So the specifics of how you organize that work are going to vary from organization to organization based on your own priorities. But it's important to understand what those audit results are, what the prevalence and severity of each of those issues are in order to come up with a plan for how to address them. The next thing you should do is set up those regression tests. So you should make sure that the accessibility level of the site when you begin this process does not degrade as you work to making fixes. And then you should provide an ongoing audit report to whatever stakeholders you may have that demonstrates progress on improving accessibility on your site as time goes by.
So how do you know when you're done? The truth is that you're never done. The accessibility is really a goal, it's not a destination. And just like your website is not just a project with a start and a finish, it's an ongoing thing that people are using and is always changing. Accessibility really needs to be a part of your institution's culture of quality. So the way to do that is that you should be gathering groups regularly to do these audits that we're going to talk about and make sure that you have some sort of continuous integration system going so that when you build features that reduce the accessibility of your site, you know about them when they happen, and you're not limiting someone's accessibility to the site.
So here's some tools to help with your evaluations. The first one I'm going to talk about today is called Site Improve. And in the interest of full disclosure, Site Improve is a partner of ally, who is our employer. Site Improve provides two different technologies that you can use. One of which is a free browser plugin, which can be used for Chrome or for Firefox. And it evaluates the accessibility of a single page at a time. So you load up a page, you start up the browser extension, it provides you with a report of the things that may be wrong on the page. So some of them are going to require manual inspection, others it can actually say, this is a problem, this does need to be fixed. And they also have an online dashboard, and this is a paid product, where you hook it up to your site, it runs a report on all of the pages on your site. You can set it up to be run automated and recurring. It can provide you with an audit report of the prevalence and severity of the issues on your site, and it can be used to track those problems over time. So you can run it against your site, deploy code changes, run it again against your site, and see what changed. So this will help you to identify regressions, and it will also help you to identify what has been fixed with the latest code push. Another advantage of using the dashboard is that it allows you to determine when problems have been introduced by your content editors. So if somebody puts an image on the site and they don't put appropriate alt text on that image, that's something that it can find. If they put a link on the site and the destination of that link gets taken down at some point, it can tell you that there's a broken link, and that's something you have to go back and fix. So you can, at a development level, make sure that your theme is as accessible as possible, but then your content editors can end up introducing inaccessible things onto your site or accessibility problems onto your site. And a tool like this can help you identify those things on a whole site level, especially if your site is very large, has a large number of pages. Using something like this that's automated can really help.
Next tool I want to talk about is Wave. I just want to show up. Has anyone here used Wave before? All right, so this is a really popular tool. It's the web accessibility evaluation tool. It's totally free. You can get an extension for Chrome or for Firefox. And as you can see, I highlighted it in the top right corner of the screenshot. It's a little button that's in your toolbar. And what it does is when you click on it on a web page, and I picked the WPCampus web page to pick on for this presentation, it creates a toolbar on the left side of your screen, and it will give you accessibility concerns at the error alert, or the error level and the alert level. And what I particularly like about this tool, why I think it's so popular, is that it also will highlight, more or less for better or for worse, kind of where these elements are on the page, so it's easy to find them in the context in which the error is occurring. A downside to the Wave tool is that it is pretty greedy, and it can call something an error that's not really an error. It's usually, like when I'm doing an audit, this tool had been the first tool that I would go to when like reviewing a feature once I've built it. But we're going to talk about some other tools later that have started to take more of the place of the Wave browser extension.
So the Axe browser extension is similar to Wave in how it functions, except one of the missions of the Axe browser extension is that it does not report false positives. So a lot of these tools are going to say, this might be a problem, you should check it out. Axe doesn't have that kind of reporting. Axe is only going to tell you something's a problem if it's a problem. So when it comes to identifying the issues on your site and fixing them, Axe is a great first pass. It should not serve as a replacement for other tools because there are items that do require manual inspection, but this is a tool that's really great to use during that first pass of identifying things you know to be problems that need to be fixed.
So Firefox in July came out with their accessibility inspector. Has anyone here tried it yet? It is amazing. Or who here is a developer and has used like the Firefox or Chrome Expect Element tools for like going over the doc? Yeah, so this is like, you have to turn it on a per page basis, but it's in Firefox now. You don't even have to get nightly or anything. And it came out like just a couple weeks now. And it basically is like an accessibility inspector that's just like the DOM element inspector. And so you can see on the screen, you go into your console just like you were gonna look at the top. And then it's one of like the pane of tools in the console, and it's all the way on the right. And you have to enable it on a per page basis, but you say turn on accessibility tools, and then the little inspector box, like it would normally be for the element inspector. It's hard to see up there, but it's like a little man next to the box. And then what happens is when you wave the wand over elements on the page, like I've highlighted it on the image, WPCampus right there, it will give you basically like the DOM hierarchy tree of the page, so you can see exactly like what would assistive technology see when they're looking at this page. It is so nice, and it is really like it's a lot easier and cleaner to read than Wave. Though I think Wave is still useful for seeing errors very quickly. This is useful for like, is my screen reader text showing where I think it should be, or are these boxes labeled semantically in a way that makes sense? I'm really excited to see where Firefox is going with this tool. And if you don't regularly develop with Firefox, this and like their grid tools have become really, really nice.
So the W3 validator has always been an indispensable tool for making sure that you're producing valid HTML. And assistive technology really expects that the HTML that it receives is going to be valid. It has much more of a difficult time parsing invalid HTML than the browser would, for example. So making sure that your HTML passes the validator check at W3 is a great first pass at ensuring that assistive technology is going to be able to use your site properly. It'll alert you to semantic problems, it'll alert you to unclosed tags, it will alert you to misbalanced tags and things like that, all of which you can clean up yourself fairly easily. The validator should be run at a per template level. You don't need to run the validator on every single page of your site because your site should be producing consistent, predictable content based on the templates you define in WordPress. So maybe you have a different template for the home page and a different template for like a post or an article page, and maybe you have a different template for your contact page. You should run all of those unique templates through the validator to make sure that your templates are producing consistent and valid code. And then for the sprawl of content, once you've let content editors go in and start adding in content to your site, something like a site improve or something that can check at a broader level would be more applicable.
Okay, so we gave you some tools for how you can audit all of the issues that you found on your site. And so the way that you should, attack that issues is by prioritizing them based on how severe they are. Like if you have, a lot of, images on your site that don't have alt text. And what will happen is if an image doesn't have alt text, as a screen reader is going to read like the whole file name of an image, that could be a severe issue. Or if you have a menu that isn't keyboard navigable, like that's a severe issue. Then like how hard is it to fix? Well, fixing like a couple of alt tags versus fixing thousands of alt tags might change where you rank that. And then how frequently does the issue happen? And what we do on our projects, we run in a agile sprint-based format so that we have a backlog of like these are all of the things in a project that we need to work on. And then, we're frequently doing audits or frequently evaluating like, is this issue still here? And then we try to take, each week we'll commit to doing a certain number of issues and, cleaning those up.
So here are some tools for continuous improvement.
We should define continuous improvement.
So continuous improvement is where you are shipping on a regular basis updates and improvements to your site, where you're constantly making it better. And when it comes to accessibility and retrofitting, that would mean that you are releasing on a regular basis things that make your site more accessible. You're never releasing something that makes it less accessible.
So this is a tool that we've used a lot in the last year. It is linter, like I talked about earlier, specifically for if you're building React applications. Can I have a show of hands how many people know what React application is? Yeah, so it's like a JavaScript-based applications, like Gutenberg blocks React. So Kevin's going to talk more about that, but what Gutenberg can do, and like I'll let Kevin talk about that. But then anyway, what eslint jsx-ally does is it's a plugin for eslint is a linter specifically for JavaScript, for ECMAScript 6. And it is awesome. It's like I said, like a spell checker for accessibility. And here's an example where this is a funny screenshot. So let me read it to you. There's a little squiggly underline under the button element, and it says emojis should be wrapped in span, have role image, and have accessible description with RA labeled by. The reason being that it's not a screen reader can't read the emoji without those things. And so the really cool thing about this is that wasn't even a rule I actually knew about. Kevin made this slide. But you know, like there are a list of best practices for accessibility that's maintained by the maintainers of this linting plugin, and it teaches you about what are the best things to do to create accessible markup. And it's not like a human being like over your shoulder being like, you must do it this way. It's a computer doing it for you, which makes it like really easy to maintain that practice within like your whole organization. It's not like one person who's just like watching out for accessibility.
So we'll talk about React in the Gutenberg context later, but something else I wanted to mention about using React in the WordPress context is if you're not using React to replace your entire front end, like there's a thing, it's a headless site where you write your entire front end in React and then it just consumes the API from WordPress. You can integrate React into your site to build things like interactive data visualizations or other types of interactives that someone would work with. And there's generally a feeling that interactives are necessarily inaccessible, but they don't have to be. And so if you're using React to build them, that jsx-ally plugin is one that can really help to make sure that you are producing accessible interactives even within a larger WordPress site that's powered by PHP. There's some software called Husky, which is available via NPM or Yarn if you use Yarn. And Husky allows you to run certain checks before pushing a branch up in Git. And so what this is really useful for is if you have a series of unit tests or a series of linting checks or something like that that you want to make sure are going to pass, you can tell Husky that it needs to run those checks before the push will be allowed to complete. And so this is run using Git hooks. And so if the check fails, the Git hook will say this is not allowed to be pushed. So it will actually prevent the developer from pushing to remote if the check fails. You can override it if you really need to, if you're pushing a work in progress or something. But the idea here is that you should be catching these issues as close to when they're introduced as possible. So instead of a developer working on a branch for maybe days, maybe weeks, and then integrating that feature and launching it, and then finding out that something's inaccessible, and trying to figure out which of the maybe several hundreds or thousands of lines of code introduced that problem, if they're committing and pushing that code regularly to the remote repository, this can catch it at the moment that it gets introduced, and you can fix it much more quickly and easily at that point because you haven't accumulated all of this code debt on top of that problem that you've already created.
So Pattie is an accessibility test running suite. It isn't only on the command line, but I hear about it a lot in the context on the command line. So you use it with a tool like Husky, and you specify like I would like to run integration tests. Can I show of hands? How people know what integration test is versus like a unit test? Okay, so an integration test is basically like I'm testing like the whole shebang. I want the whole web page tested. Not just like one little discrete piece of it, but like I want to make sure that everything looks good as it's supposed to work together. All of the PHP, all of the JavaScript, as it would load through a web browser. So the way it does that is it uses Phantom.js, which is a headless web browser. So it's like running through Chrome, but it's not really Chrome. And then it uses HTML code sniffer, which is you think of it like it validates HTML. And you run it through Node. So that's really cool because then you could use a tool like Husky to say, hey, every time that someone pushes this commit, please run my accessibility integration tests before this commit goes up to Git. And that's a way that you can run these tests every time. So like Kevin said, you can narrow down to which particular commit introduced the bug. So you can address it right there and then, and you're not like piling up technical debt later for like when someone calls you up and is like, I can't access your website, and you're like, I have no idea when this issue happened.
Yeah, it also integrates with continuous integration tools, and so you could integrate it with something like Travis CI to run those checks prior to doing something like merging a pull request and doing it. So how to solve common problems? There's a number of issues that are relatively common in accessibility. There are technical considerations, and then there are also editorial considerations. So the technical considerations can get solved by your developers, where making sure that if an alt text value is entered into the media manager, that actually makes it into the code that's being generated in the template. For example. Making sure that the heading levels that are set in the templates are hierarchical and are the appropriate order. Making sure that the navigation is keyboard accessible. All of those things are things that are the purview of the developer when they're building out the theme. But then there's also the editorial considerations where problems can be introduced by people entering content. So if they're entering content and they're putting in their own headings, they may enter headings out of order. So these are the kinds of things that can be solved by other tools that perform these audits.
So then developers are really only one part of the accessibility puzzle. You have content editors too. You could have developed a very accessible theme, or you could have bought a very accessible theme. But then you can introduce accessibility errors in the content you write. So I want to talk about a couple things that you could take back to your organizations tomorrow to, practices you can start incorporating in your content generation. The first is what is appropriate alt text on an image. It shouldn't be identical to the caption of the image. It shouldn't be nothing at all because nothing at all may read the title of the image. It is okay if it's an empty string, if it is a decorative image. The appropriate way to use alt text on an image is that it should describe what the image is, as if you were like talking to your mom on the phone and you were telling her what the image looks like. So that often is different than the caption. The second thing I wanted to talk about was that headings are very important to assistive technology, and heading order is very important. So if you have an article, the title should always be an H1 tag. That's the highest level heading. And even though the HTML spec says that in different elements you can have multiple H1 tags, in practice, screen readers don't understand that. So you really only should have one H1 tag on a page. And hopefully in the future the spec will be honored. So what that means is that the title should be the H1, and you should tell your content editors that second level headings, so subheads within an article should be H2, and then headings that will go under those subheadings, which should be H3. So every H2 has an H1 parent, every H3 has an H2 parent. And that's very important because you can skip down the screen based on the heading order. So true for developers too. Don't just use heading tags to make your text bigger or smaller. They have very important semantic meaning to a screen reader. And then the third point is that your link text should always be descriptive. And this is like just great SEO advice. It's not just great accessibility advice. The text that your editor highlights shouldn't just be like, for example, to go see my report, click here, and then highlight, click here, make that a link. That is bad. The link should be something like, go see my report about how to write accessible links, and the body of the link or the contents of the link should be that full sentence.
Let's talk about Gutenberg. Is there anybody here who doesn't know what Gutenberg is? Excellent. So Gutenberg is a new block editing experience that's coming to WordPress. And it has promise and it has peril.
That's fair.
I'm just calling that maybe the best description I've heard.
Yeah.
The beta version that's out right now has a number of issues with accessibility inside of the editing experience. So there are a number of issues that are in the public GitHub that are tagged with accessibility, with the accessibility working group within WordPress has identified. Mostly due to problems with keyboard navigation and with loss of context. So because Gutenberg is written in React, a lot of elements are created and destroyed as you click on different things and navigate through the Gutenberg editing experience. So if you are somebody who is blind, who's using a screen reader, this is very disorienting. And it's a very big problem for the editing experience with Gutenberg. So there is a commitment on behalf of the Gutenberg team to try to resolve these issues prior to launch because they recognize the severity of them, but not all of these issues have been fixed yet. So that's something to keep an eye on. The accessibility of the HTML that it produces on the front end is much better because it's essentially producing the same kind of HTML that you see out of the regular TinyMCD content editor that already exists in WordPress. So as far as your front end users are concerned, it's less of a problem. But you can create custom blocks in Gutenberg, and these blocks can get reused on different post types. And it's incumbent upon the developer, just like it would be if you were writing your own shortcode, to make sure that the output of those is accessible and that you're pulling in the appropriate information to make those things accessible. So if you allow your user to select an image, for example, you need to make sure that the alt text accompanies that image. If you're allowing your user to set headings, you need to make sure that the appropriate heading level is set. You can customize these blocks as well. So if you don't want them to put it in H1 because H1 is handled by the template, you can remove that ability. One of the real promises of Gutenberg is that the save method in Gutenberg is a React component. And React components are representing HTML. They're representing a structure within the DOM. And so that jsx-ally plugin we mentioned earlier is able to lint your Gutenberg block save method or render method before it actually makes its way onto the front end. A lot of these tools that we've talked about today are used within the context of a browser as an extension or an inspector, or they are hitting a public URL and they're analyzing the HTML. In my opinion, that's too late because you've already put that in as part of a larger whole, and you should be able to inspect these problems ahead of time. It was always a problem to be able to inspect the HTML that was produced by PHP templates because of the variance within PHP templates. With React components, we're able to programmatically understand how that markup is being produced, and we're able to lint it. So that jsx-ally plugin, linting against the save method in Gutenberg blocks, lets you have a much earlier understanding of when you're going to have accessibility challenges with those blocks that you're creating. It doesn't replace a page-level analysis because it's not going to tell you whether your heading order is correct. It's not going to tell you whether your nesting is correct with blocks as they get put together with other blocks or inside of a cohesive whole, but it does allow you to check the accessibility of the blocks that you are creating much earlier in the process in a much more automated fashion and with greater detail.
So we saved about 10 minutes at the end for questions. I wanted to say that there's been really great conversation on the WPCampus hashtag, and I've seen and learned about several other very cool accessibility tools through the course of this conference. There was another one I saw in a WPCampus live stream back from January where someone from NC State University, I believe, was developing a plugin that would basically do like a wave extension level analysis on content as your editor saved it, which was very cool, and I'm very excited to see where that goes. So I want to take this time to thank you all for coming. We're open for questions, and also if anyone else has any cool tools they'd like to share, I think now's a great time. Go for it.
Does anybody mention?
This is very WordPress specific. When in regards to accessibility, we have a checker that we've been trying to use called Lancito, and it goes down these rabbit holes of not only checking your page, but then checking the JavaScript that you're linking to, and then the libraries that those JavaScripts are referring to within them, and the style sheets that those JavaScripts are referring to. At what point do you just take it on faith that the plugin that you're using has already done that due diligence, and you don't have to look at the style sheet of a library of a plugin to make sure that it's not using bad color contrast in some scenario that you may not be aware of? Is there a list of accessibility compliance with plugins, I guess is the question.
Not that I'm aware of, and that's why, oh yes.
So they can hear it.
So the question was, is there a point where, or a list where you could see the plugins have been compliant with accessibility standards? And as far as I'm aware of, I haven't come across anything like that. And that's why I would say using something like Site Improve, which does like that continuous testing on your site to make sure that if you did introduce a plugin that maybe had a color contrast issue, that would flag that for you as you added it.
Yeah, I mean, to that, I would say also that one of the talks we listened to yesterday established some rules under which plugins will be brought into the organization, and you should be very careful about which plugins you allow in. Same with things like JavaScript libraries, third-party libraries, iframes, things like that. So I would say that at that point, you should evaluate the accessibility of that particular plugin or tool, and then only use ones that you know to be accessible. Which is not to say that they might introduce a problem later on, but at least at the point at which it gets introduced, you know that it meets the standards that you're looking for. And then to Pattie's point, if you have ongoing monitoring, you could identify situations in which there's a problem. And ideally, it's open source, and you either put in a support request or you put in a PR, and it gets fixed.
I was just curious if anybody else had mentioned Tenant at all. Yeah, so Tenant, it has its own service, its own API. It has, we're using Site Improve right now, and we're going to be putting Tenant through its paces because we signed up for that service as well. But it also has, similar to what Site Improve has, it has the ability to crawl the site and index what the problems are. It also has a lot of really awesome command line stuff. You can integrate it into the workflow. So gulp, grunt, whatever, it has its own linter that you just plug in, and it has a plugin for WordPress so that can monitor site content and say, hey, you're not allowed to publish until you actually give this an alt tag or something like that.
Yeah, so the question was about a site called Tenon, is that right?
T-E-N-O-N.
T-E-N-O-N.
.io.
And TENON.io, and so it's similar to Site Improve. It has a WordPress plugin, it has command line tools, it provides ongoing monitoring, so something else to look at. I haven't personally heard of that one, but I'll have to check it out. Something else I wanted to mention that just I remember we forgot to talk about in the body of the talk was we had discussed in a couple other sessions the idea that users need to test the site, actual live users need to test the site. And preferably, users that have different types of disabilities should be tested. That it's not enough, for me as a mostly sighted person to go through and test the site, even with something like a screen reader. You can ask your disability services office if they can help with this, and it's possible that you could maybe get some student volunteers that do have different types of disability to test the site. Maybe provide them with a gift card to the union or something like that. I know that in my experience, there were organizations that would run basically research projects, and they'd have student volunteers, and they give them $10 or $20 or something like that for their participation. So that may be a source of user testing that is not exorbitantly expensive, and that actually does test on users within your organization that you're trying to ultimately help. So. Well, if anybody else has any questions, then thank you for your time.